Welcome to Horror in Detail. Are you ready to embark on a chilling journey into the realms of darkness? The mysterious and the bone-chilling world of horror stories. On this channel, we are dedicated to unraveling the most terrifying tales that will send shivers down your spine. First story. This story was shared by you/no_issue_9916. I spent the weekend at my mom's friend's house. Needless to say, I won't be going back. For the sake of privacy, I'm going to call myself Howard. A few years ago, I'd say this would have been around late 2018, so I was about 13. Me, my mom, my stepdad, and my grandmother all spend the weekend at my mom's friend's house, which sits about a mile off the coast of Lake Huron in northern Michigan. I was extremely nervous. Since my mom told me it was heavily forested area, I was scared of the wolves and/or bears that live up there. I love forests, just not the things that live in them. I kept telling my family, I don't want to go, there could something in the woods there. And either my mom or stepdad would try to comfort me by saying something like, it'll be fine, if anything happens, we'll protect you, or there's a lot of us. Nothing would be brave enough to fight us, which kind of helped because turned out there would have a lot of people there. 7 people there and the 4 of us. It was about 5 p.m. when we left our house in the southern regions of Michigan and was about 8 p.m. when we arrived. It was a lake house on the outskirts of Bay City. When we got there, I was reminded of my fear from earlier. The house sat in a large clearing and was surrounded by miles of forest on all sides. I got a sense of dread at the sight, but I tried to ignore it. I met the friends. They were pretty nice. We got pizza from the local pizza place, and I mostly forgot about the forest. I was sitting in the kitchen watching YouTube on my phone. They were all hanging out in the basement where there was a TV, a pool table, all sorts of cool stuff. It was just after 11 p.m. when I heard something scraping up against the wall outside. On the other side of the stove, I was sitting a good 10 feet from said stove. For perspective, the main floor sat about 5 feet off the ground. There were stairs that led up to a small porch. I noticed the sound when the video I was watching ended. It sounded like multiple shard things scraping against the wall. I was too scared to look for the cause of the sound. Suddenly the sound stopped and it walked into the backyard. It was a deer. I was immediately relieved, as I was taught deer were a symbol of peace and freedom. So I smiled as it pranced into the forest beyond the backyard. My mom asked if I was okay, saying I still looked spooked. I told her the truth. I heard scraping outside, but it was just a deer. She chuckled. Oh yeah, I've heard their antlers scraping against stuff so many times, and it startles me every time. Then she told me they were all going to bed, and so did I. I went to bed on the couch in the living room. I brought my Jurassic World blanket. I slept rather well, despite my fear of the surroundings. The woman, my mom's best friend at the time, the person she came to see specifically, who for the sake of privacy we'll call Carissa, woke me up saying, "Hey Howard, wake up buddy, it's bright outside." I got up rather quick since I still didn't fully trust the place. I checked my phone. It was somehow 2 p.m. I guess I slept in. I went outside. They had a cute husky named Blitz. I played with him for at least 2 hours. He was super playful. He had a soccer ball he liked fetching, so I made him fetch the ball for a while. We then went to the lake, all 10 of us, but I didn't want to go. I'm not a social person, but my mom gave me no choice. One of my worst fears came true. When we got to the beach, the friends had their own friends who had kids. Before I continue, I want to preface this by saying I don't like kids, especially little kids, and that's exactly what they were. 3 little kids. I don't remember how old they were, but they were young, no more than 6. Little kids annoy the hell out of me. I had a cousin in my home state, Tennessee, that was half my age, so I know how little kids are. I brought my phone, and I just sat just beyond tree line. The woods were right across from the beach, just a few dozen yards. I was okay with this patch of forest. It was bright as hell, and there were so many people there. So I felt safe, and I watched YouTube again. I was sitting there for a good hour and a half, and the minutes that followed was when the strangeness reared its head. I remember every detail of those moments. I was watching the Hodgwins, specifically their video where they read an email from a guy who asked if he should go back to his ex-girlfriend. I was quietly laughing, but my laughter was quickly killed by something deeper in the forest. I heard what sounded like my grandmother calling to me from a few hundred feet away. I was about to get up and follow her voice when I stopped myself, because I remembered she was sitting next to my mom on the beach. I could see her in the opposite direction of the voice. The voice sounded slightly off, like my grandmother was out of breath. I could hear her saying something that vaguely sounded like, "Howard, come here, boy," which is something she always says when she needed me. She'd calling me boy. I noped the hell out of there and went back to my grandmother and sat in the empty chair next to her and told her, "I heard someone calling me in the woods, and they had your voice." Her and my mom looked me in confusion, and my mom said, "They sounded like her." And I explained, the voice sounded like Grandma does when she's out of breath, like when she climbs the stairs to her apartment, exactly the same. They both looked at me like I was an idiot. They said I was making it up and I was just trying to go home, which made no sense to me, still doesn't make sense. I spent the next 5 minutes insisting it was true, but they kept saying I was making excuses. But I knew better. I knew exactly what I heard. I sat next to them for the rest of our time at the beach. About an hour later, we headed back to the house. Carissa's friends came with us. The couple with the 3 kids, 5 of us rode in one vehicle, and the others rode in another vehicle. I rode with the people I know. It was pretty dark by that point, not pitch black, but you still would have needed light to see. We were surrounded by forest for a good minute of the drive back. The tree line was maybe 6 feet away from each side of the van. For the moment we were surrounded by woods, I could have sworn I saw a dark figure running with us just beyond the tree line, but I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. It was about a 5-minute drive from the beach to the house. When we got there, the kids raced into the house, playing, being loud and rambunctious and all. I waited for my mom to go inside before I did, to avoid as much interaction with the kids as possible. Once we all settled in, the parents of the kids told me I should play with the kids, since I was a kid too, but I didn't know what to do. So they guided my outside with the 3 little shits, then told us we could play with Blitz. I approached the dog with the kids behind me. I crouched down and started to pet Blitz. He was really friendly and clearly seemed to enjoy it. He rolled over on his side, wanting me to rub his belly, so I did. After a minute or 2 of petting him, I grabbed the ball and gestured for him to play, but he didn't move. I figured he was too tired. Then went out of nowhere. The oldest of the kids said, "Hey, you stupid dog," and kicked Blitz in the ass, pretty hard too, clearly annoyed with him for not playing. The dog barked angrily, quickly got up and tried to pounce the boy, but I grabbed Blitz's collar before he could do anything, and the family ran out to see the commotion, and Carissa came to calm the dog down, and the kid was crying his eyes out. I went over to my mom as she asked what happened. I told her the kid kicked Blitz for not wanting to play, and Blitz wasn't having any of it, and I told her the kid deserved it, and it seemed like she somewhat agreed with me, saying, "Well, you shouldn't hurt animals like that, or that's gonna happen." They all went back inside, taking the kids with them, and Carissa was mad at the dog for simply protecting himself. I sat next to him and continued petting him, this time for a solid 5 minutes, praising him, calling him a good boy, since it was the kid's fault for being an asshole. I then heard a stick break in the woods about 100 yards away, but it sounded less like a stick, more like a branch being crushed. As soon as I heard the sound, Blitz shot up and stared in the direction of the sound. He got up and sniffed the air and started growling. His fur stood up at a cartoonish level. He was baring his teeth. He scooched next to me, clearly trying to protect me from whatever was over there. And whatever it was clearly a threat. He started barking again, but this time, the barks were of pure anger. His barks sounded primal. I stood there, trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness, trying to see something. My heart was pounding. I thought it was going to explode. Suddenly, Blitz took off into the forest, after whatever was there, completely ripping out his tie-out stake. I ran into the house and told everyone that Blitz ran after something in the woods and I couldn't stop him. Then Carissa's husband, I'll call him Steve, and my stepdad. Steve grabbed his rifle from their room and sprinted out the door, followed by my stepdad, who got his pistol from the basement as he brought it with him, and they both charged into the woods. They were very fit guys, so I figured they could either shoot or beat up whatever was out there. I thought it was a person or maybe a bear or wolf that was out there. We turned off all the lights in the house, opened the window that faced the direction they went, and we sat there for a good 5 minutes or more. We saw and heard nothing. Another 5 minutes, nothing. After a few more minutes, we heard very faint gunshots coming from the woods. It sounded like he was quite far away. They must have been a mile away by now. Carissa wanted to go out there and look for him, but Steve ordered we stay inside no matter what happens, and my mom reminded her of that. We stayed up for a few hours, hoping they would come back at some point, but they didn't. We hesitantly went to bed, and I could hear Carissa bawling her eyes out in the basement. I slept on the couch again, and I made sure the curtains were closed, just in case the stranger returns. I took about 20 minutes to fall asleep, so I decided to listen to some ASMR, specifically Goodnight Moon. If nothing else could bring me comfort, then she can. I woke up early the next morning. I checked my phone, and it was 9 a.m. The sun was shining through the cracks of the same. Everyone was still asleep. I got up and let out a big stretch before walking over to the back porch. I opened the curtains, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. I saw Steve and my stepdad, or what was left of them. Whatever that thing was last night, whatever they and the dog went after, it tore them apart. I could barely recognize them. That's how mutilated they were. My stepdad was missing his lower half. His insides were sprawled out all over the place. Steve's throat was torn out, his legs missing, and his chest was torn open. He had huge claw marks all over his body. They both looked like parts of them were eaten by something big. I noticed all this in the split second I was staring, and out of shock and disgust, I blurted out, "What the fuck?" at the top of my lungs. That woke up everyone, and they all came running up the stairs. It felt like a stampede with all the people running, and they all saw the horrifying scene. At that moment, everyone started screaming and crying. My mom and Carissa both ran to theirs and held the two men. The mother of the kids kept them back so they couldn't see the death, and her husband called 911. After 10 minutes or so of panic, the cops arrived and we showed them the gruesome scene, and they both gagged and nearly vomited at the sight. They called for the chief and medical professionals to take care of the bodies. My mom and Carissa sat there next to the bodies, absolutely devastated, crying a river until the paramedics arrived, who then took the bodies away. The cops stayed and questioned us. I didn't hear what the cops asked them, but after some time, they started to question me, and since I'm a kid, they took their down stern tone a few notches, and they asked me questions like, "How did you discover the bodies? What happened the night before? And did you hear anything through the night?" And of course, I answered truthfully. After questioning everyone, They left, and we all sat there in dismay. And my mom broke the silence by saying, "What could have done that?" And I told her no animal could do something like that. And my grandmother asked, "Why would the thing leave them there? Is it taunting us?" And after a few minutes of discussion, we decided to Google things like biggest animals in Michigan, bear claw marks, deaths in Bay County, and turns out there were quite a few missing person reports in this area. And the victims were either found dead, found alive but injured, or were never found at all. I had a big imagination growing up, so I Googled folktales from the region, and there were a bunch of results. The Michigan Dogman, Bigfoot, the Wendigo, and some other creatures that don't fit the description of what we're dealing with here. I watched videos on some of the creatures. I watched a video talking about Bigfoot. Definitely not it. Then I watched one about the Dogman. The claw marks on Steve and my stepdad were similar, but much bigger and deeper than what the video showed. Not it. I even watched a video about skinwalkers, but no, we're too far north for them. Then I watched a video about the Wendigo, and the realization hit me like a freight train. Dear Lord, I thought. I wanted to show the others, but I knew they'd get mad at me and yell at me. So I didn't tell them. I still tried to convince myself it really was just a bear, but I knew better. We then sat in silence for another hour or so. Everyone was crying except me. I didn't know Steve, and my stepdad was an asshole, so I was more shocked than sad. The silence was broken again, but by the sound of whimpering outside. We looked outside, and it was Blitz. He was hurt but alive. We all ran outside to greet him as he limped towards the house. He had a claw mark along his body. It ran along the entire side of his body, but it wasn't deep at all. My guess was he just got caught in the crossfire of the confrontation last night. Carissa and the mother of the kids both rushed Blitz to the vet. But don't worry, he survived. After we calmed down from the excitement of the dog's survival, we returned to the house, and so did the women after a few hours. I went to the basement after some time and found the 3 kids all cowering in the corner, crying. Apparently they saw Steve and my stepdad as the medics put them in body bags. Their mom held them and comforted them, but they never calmed down. We were all in a state of panic. We didn't feel safe in the house at all, and we didn't go outside at all that day. We stayed in the house and watched TV all day. We didn't eat either. It was around 1 a.m. when we all went to bed, but not me. I've always had really bad paranoia, and tonight, my paranoia was 10,000-fold. I would jump at every sound. The house creaked a lot, and it scared me every time. It was maybe 3 a.m. when I heard a familiar sound, antlers scraping against the wall outside. The same wall as the deer from the first night, and a sense of comfort came over me, which was quickly overcome by dread when I noticed that the scraping was coming from directly on the other side of the wall. The deer from the other night was scraping its antlers, but it sounded like it was coming from the floor. Since I mentioned the main floor is about 5 feet off the ground, but this time, the scraping was coming from directly in front of me, and my heart sank. What can stand 10 feet off the ground? I truly thought it was a bear, but a grizzly bear. They're massive, and it was probably marking the house with its claws. I stood there in darkness and silence, waiting for the sounds to stop, and they did. So I quickly made my way to the back door. I crouched down and peeked through the curtain, oh so slightly. Thankfully, they had lights around the backyard, along the tool shed, along the railing of the back deck. There were even light poles that ran all the way from town into the clearing here, and the moon was fully visible too, so I could see outside very well. What I saw was worse than anything I could have ever imagined. It was a creature that looked like a deer of sorts, but it was more the size of a moose. It had huge antlers, bigger than any cervid should have. Its mouth slightly agape. It had razor-sharp teeth. Its head was just a skull, no flesh at all. It had fur along its back that looked matted and worn out and had a dark brown, almost black color. The most striking feature of this thing was its size. It was walking quadrupedal and still seemed to be close to 7 feet tall at the shoulder. I let out a quick gasp. I couldn't control my fear. It must have hurt it, because it shot its head back towards the house. I watched in horror as it stood up on its hind legs. It stood there and looked at the house intently, which let me get a good look at this thing. It easily stood 12 feet tall. It looked incredibly scrawny and malnourished. Its arms were long, reaching its knees, and its hands ended with huge claws. All those featured matched that of a Wendigo, at least what that video told me. It started slowly walking towards the house. I jumped back on the couch, got under my blanket, and waited for it to go away. I heard its footsteps come onto the deck, but its footsteps were incredibly quiet, which explains why I only heard it when it stepped on the branch the previous night. I saw its shadow creep up to the back door. Its shadow consumed the entire curtain. No moonlight peeked through as it stood there. My heart sank to my stomach when I remembered I didn't lock the back door before trying to go to bed, and as that thought ran through my head, I heard the door slowly open. I felt the cold air rush in. As sweat rushed down my body, I could see the breeze hit the curtains. I then saw a head slowly grab the curtain and slide it aside. The creature opened the door fully so it could fit through, and even then, its crown of antlers slowly scraped against the doorway as it walked in. It calmly and quietly searched the kitchen, looking everywhere. I could tell it was looking for something. I watched it intently as it skulked through the darkness towards me. As it walked up to me, now merely feet away from me, it seemed to stare at me as if it knew I was there, but couldn't do anything. And I noticed it had a nasty bite in its neck. Blitz damn near ripped its throat out the previous night. It had this awful smell of death, like rotten meat and shit mixed together. I could barely keep myself from vomiting on the beast. Then it did something that surprised me. It extended its hand towards me. Not like it was inspecting me or toying with me, but it reached its hand out like it wanted me to take its hand. But I learned from the video that the Wendigo loves to trick people. So I just sat there, frozen in fear. I stared at it, its hand still extended. As if things couldn't get stranger, it started talking to me. It had a voice similar to my grandmother's. "Come with me, boy," in the same fashion she always does, but the voice was off. Instead of sounding out of breath, it sounded annoyed, like how she would sound if I was taking too long. I continued to ignore it, which I think pissed it off, because it gave up, put its hand down and leaned closer to my face. The smell was unbearable. I just laid there and closed my eyes, accepting death. I felt it open its nasty maw to do me like it did Steve and my stepdad. At that moment, I heard someone coming up the stairs from the basement. The beast heard them and ran out the back door, and in a matter of 2 seconds, it had already vanished into the trees. When I got up to close the door, my grandmother and my mom both appeared behind me. My grandmother said, "Why is the door open, boy?" And I replied, "It was hot in here, and no bear is fast enough to get in here before I close it." They both stood in the kitchen, getting something from the fridge, and I noticed the beast left a little bit of blood on the floor, which I quickly wiped up with a paper towel, and thankfully I got rid of it before they saw it. If they saw the blood, there's no way I could have explained myself. They don't believe in monsters. The next morning, I was more than happy to get out of that hellhole, and we drove all the 3 hours back home. I can't believe I met the Wendigo. Nothing in my entire life will ever come close to being as scary as that weekend. A few weeks later, we had a closed casket funeral in Grand Rapids, and my mom stopped talking to them after that. I guess there was just too much trauma between them, but they let us a blitz after that, since our place was much more remote than their place. His scars have healed since then, but his fur is a slightly different color where the scars once were. What was crazy is that about a month after the funeral, Carissa and the whole family went missing overnight. Her friend, the friend's husbands, and the 3 kids. Apparently their disappearance was discovered by the same cops that they called that weekend. We read the missing persons report, and all that was found was a blanket and a shoe that belonged to one of the kids. The house was resold about 2 years ago. God forbid the new family has a run-in with that monster. Second story. This story was shared by you/SnooHamsters5656. There's something in the forest. I used to live in Texas countryside. Duncanville, I would say. This happened in 1992, so I might have imagined the whole ordeal. I was always near my parents' house, rarely straying away from it. I had, for whatever reason, to venture out into the wilderness and explore it. There was a forest by the house, where my dad would let me go in order to get a little exercise. The sun was out, the birds were chirping, and the shriveled leaves were swaying in the gentle breeze. I picked up sticks from the ground and swung them at the trees. This was something I did almost every day in the summer. If I wasn't doing that, I was playing Super Mario World with my brother on his SNES. But we never could beat it. It was frustrating. We'd take turns trying to beat it on the same area. It didn't help that we'd take turns and then get mad at each other when one of us would die. Other than that, we were pretty good with each other. Walking outside one day, I followed the path until I saw something pale red at the end. Surrounded by a chain-link fence and rusty cars was a barn. It contrasted so much with the trees, it didn't look like it belonged. I cautiously walked towards it, suspicious of what it was. The large wooden doors loomed above me, like a Lovecraftian monster's maw. I look in front of myself. The door was chained shut. I was wondering what to do with it, maybe cut it open or rattle the door. I was about to leave, but I heard the chain move behind me. I looked back. A bloodied ID card fell from one of the branches above me. I stepped back in shock. It said Stuart Varland. I recognized the name. Stuart was a family friend, a police officer, along with my dad, and had disappeared recently. I heard the chain again, flinched, and stepped a bit closer. The door was almost open, only stopped by the chain. Gargantuan hands were trying to pry it open. I'm pretty sure I was hyperventilating at this point. I started running, but tripped and fell. I backed myself up against a tree just before the barn door was busted open by a giant beast. I remember seeing it for one brief moment, that horrible dark shape shrouded in the darkness of the barn. It just stared at me. I was terrified, frozen in place. It wouldn't move or acknowledge me at all. It was wearing riot armor and remnants of a shirt. The monster looked around and saw me sitting there. It gave a deep, throaty roar, one that continues to be stuck in my mind to this day. It charged towards me, and I just barely dodged. I ran back to my house, the thing still following me. Or so I thought. I looked back, and it was just gone. The barn and everything was still there, but the creature was nowhere to be seen. My dad opened the front door, probably about to get me for dinner. He brought me inside to the kitchen table. For plates of Salisbury steak, peas and mashed potatoes were on the table, and my brother and my mom were already sat down. We all ate in silence. Almost immediately afterwards, it was time for me and my brother to go to bed. I told my brother good night. He nodded and smiled. My mom came in and gave me a hug, just barely cheering me up. It took me hours to fall asleep completely, because I kept having nightmares. Sometimes, I still wonder, is it still out there? Third story. This story was shared by you/large_staff_4750. Stories of the ex-battalion, the Black Forest. So, I'm a soldier, part of a task force that doesn't exist. It is kept that way to protect the interests of the people of my country, aka They don't want people to panic. I was part of the regiment designated to guard an area of forest known as the Black Forest. It's called that way because almost no light can get through it, and thus the things that are in it don't experience light often, and thus rely on sound. I was tasked with taking 20 other men into a recon mission deep into the forest. This would have been a 5-day mission. On the first day, 2 men disappeared. We heard a shout from behind and 2 at the back were gone. We would find them on the way out. They didn't even have time to shoot their guns at them. We pushed on to discover what we could hear. As the night fell, we began to make camp. It would turn out that they preferred non-moving targets, and thus we were targeted. 2 more died then. Our radios cut out that very night. We didn't realize this until the next day at its end, when we were supposed to sign in with the base to confirm that we were alive. During the day again, nobody was taken, but that night we saw what it was that was stalking us. It was vaguely humanoid, but elongated ears and a perfectly smoothed out face, other than its barbed mouth. We saw it then because we stumbled into its den. A soldier suggested that we tried to sneak up on it and take it out. He tried, but was quickly heard, and then we saw what it did to those it caught. It ripped him, limb from limb, and we only heard the screams end into gurgling in what I can assume is his own blood, until the radio as he died. We, all 16 of us, all decided to spend the night, thinking that it wouldn't think to hunt so close to its den. We were sorely wrong. 5 men died that day, and the rest were left shaking and huddling close to their guns as if it were their last tether to reality. The next day we ran back to the camp, making it about 3/4 THS of the way there, before night fell. This time, all 11 of us didn't sleep. We huddled around each other, all preparing to fight that thing to the death. 3 more died, but we managed to injure it, and now it has some new scars to remember us by. We made it to camp, and we were all taken to the medics, who checked us all for injury. Apparently 3 of the men had a marking on their backs, claw marks. It had been toying with us some of the nights. I have since requested a transfer to a different guarding post, now guarding another thing I can't say, or else I will be thrown in jail. NCO agreement, or my country's counterpart. I will be answering questions, if there are any. I have more stories, but that is for later. Bye. 4th story. This story was shared by you/Morpherman. I always read stories about skinwalkers, now I've killed one. I always read stories about skinwalkers, now I've killed one. I remember back when I was a high school kid reading creepypasta stories on /x/. The skinwalker ones always stuck out to me. You know, the ones where the people are in some remote location, then one of them disappears for a bit and comes back different. Then starts BAAING like a goat, and they run away blah blah blah. They're all similar, but I found the idea so interesting. Creepy goat beasts that pretend to be human? Sign me up. My only problem with the stories are how helpless the people always were. Sometimes the people would fire a shot and all it would do is slow the creature down. Fair. But first they would take too long to figure out something is up. Or they would just try to run and hide. That never worked out. I'll admit, skinwalkers are damn scary. I know now from experience. But I also know the only way to beat one is to fight. I do have something to admit. I was a serious addict at the time. Not to one particular thing. I just didn't want to be in my own skin. I wouldn't say I was homeless, more like a nomad. I had some money in the bank and a car, but not much else. Well, except for the copious amounts of drugs. I have 2 years sober now. But this story is from 5 years ago. Even after I fought a fucking monster, I didn't get clean. The scariest monsters are the ones inside of us. But skinwalkers are pretty scary too. Here's my recount, to the best of my memory. It was raining in Detroit. I had been driving back from Canada after getting some exquisite MXC. Cheap and well made. Thanks, Canada. I figured since it was pouring and getting dark, I'd find an old abandoned house to sleep in. I drove down a few of the roads in the outskirts of the city, dilapidated houses on both sides of me. Many of them had water pouring through their broken windows. Some of them were partially caved in, wherein neglect taking their toll. One was on fire. Detroit really had become a shithole. My best guess was water had gotten into some electrics. I heard sirens in the distance. Good sign though, since that meant electricity was flowing down the block. I drove a bit more, until I saw a house that fit my 3 criteria. It wasn't leaking, it wasn't occupied, and it wasn't on fire. It was a pretty nice house, 1 floor, small but comfortable, redwood paneling on the outside, white bordered windows, even a stone chimney. I went around back through the overgrown yard, picked the miraculously unbroken door, and got out of the rain. I checked the place out, and it was like I had walked into heaven. The bedroom had a mattress, the sink wasn't gross and had running water, and there was an electric stove that worked. Today was my lucky day. I unpacked some of my things, threw my sleeping bag on the mattress, and set some water to boil while charging my laptop. See, I told you I wasn't homeless. I liked a bit of comfort in my life. I had my cooler with milk and butter too, so my mac and cheese was damn delicious. And finally, I had my time to get high. It should be noted, I've never hallucinated. Even after taking tons of acid or shrooms, I only had the color effects and swirling. Distortion but not projection. So imagine my confusion when, sitting in the warm light I had on in a sturdy chair, high out of my mind, I heard a BAA sound outside. I wasn't scared, but since when were there fucking goats in Detroit? Weird. But I was occupied, so I got back to watching YouTube on my phone. Come morning, I woke up to find it was still raining. Great. I was honestly enjoying my stay in a somewhat furnished house, so I pulled out my laptop and got to some browsing. Of course, I helped myself to ingesting a bit more MXC, plus a bowl or 2, and I was quite content. Then I heard a knock on the door. Fuck. We'd always made me paranoid, and while it was slightly negated by the MXC, being in a house I had technically broken in to put me on edge. I hope to God it wasn't the police, but I answered the door nonetheless. There stood a man, soaking wet, clearly high. I thought, hey, unless this guy shanks me, we could be best buddies. He wasn't intimidating, a bit shorter than me and scrawny, with unmatched shoes a size too big and uncut scraggly hair. Hey boss, help a guy get out of the cold and rain for a bit. I said sure, who was I to say no? It wasn't my house, and we exchanged some pleasantries as he came in. I don't think he was in any state of mind to determine that the house had clearly been abandoned, but even if he was, he didn't say anything. He just sat down in a chair and rode whatever wave he was on. I continued my own browsing, taking a bit more MXE out of sight from him than offering him to smoke. He happily obliged. I figured another druggie wouldn't care to steal some guy's weed. But a white powder? Even I'd steal that if I saw it. A few hours passed and the rain let up. He thanked me, got up, and left. Another human interaction with no trouble, a win in my book. Since it was around 5, I made myself a cup of ramen and continued on with my never-ending journey of dousing my self-loathing with chemicals. I threw down a bottle of cheaply acquired Robitussin to add to my high, and waited for it to hit. Once the hour of waiting was up, I felt the new sensations flowing through my veins, and lay down to get through a bit of nausea. As I was lying there, something passed through my peripheral vision outside. It almost looked like a goat. I wasn't going to be getting up unless the bed under me was on fire, so I stopped caring. Then came the BAA again. My mind, neurons now shooting quickly in succession to recognize any pattern, went right to the stories of skinwalkers. I vividly remembered everything and a part of me, a small part, wished that I was dealing with one. I fantasized about being in the woods, seeing a friend come back as something wrong. I went through the possibilities, how I would handle it. Plans and plans ran through my brain. Setting wild booby traps, shooting it with a machine gun, and many more I don't remember. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next day, I felt like absolute garbage. My stomach couldn't handle an entire bottle of cough syrup like it used to. Now I know that I was getting stomach ulcers, but I was still in the midst of my addiction then, so I didn't really care. I drank some milk and took an Alka-Seltzer, popped a few Xanax, and passed out for the next 16 hours. I woke up to loud knocking on the door. I tumbled out of the bed, headed to the door, then noted it's pitch black outside, raining again, and I don't actually live here. Who the fuck could that be? I got to the door and tried looking through the peephole, but couldn't see a thing. Then I heard the knocking again, loud and fast, like it was an emergency. I popped back to where my bag was, grabbed my admittedly crummy old gun, and pocketed it. Then I opened the door. There stood the man from the other day, drenched again, looking down at the ground. I asked him if he was okay, and he slowly turned his head up. He locked eyes with me, and a shiver went down my spine. Something was different. "Hey boss, help a guy get out of the cold and rain for a bit," he said as he did the first time, but the slur of his words was gone and his voice had this strange nasal sound to it. Against my better judgment, I let him in. He walked rigidly now, much less talkative. He sat down where I offered and just stared at me, like I was something novel, like I was something different. I packed and lit up a bowl since he was seriously making me uncomfortable. Then I offered it to him. He stared at me like I had two heads, then took it and inhaled, mimicking me. That was a bad idea. I quickly noticed a few things. He was now coughing so hard it looked like his face was about to come loose. Then it did, like a kid wearing a Halloween mask that slid to one side. His pupils turned into rectangles, and his hands had ripped open, peeling back like a banana peel, revealing claws. I had just gotten a skinwalker high. I stared at him, at it, dumbfounded for a second, before the primal part of me took over. I don't know how I pulled it off, but my brain fired the emergency switch, ran to the bedroom, grabbed my bag with everything in it, crushed up an Adderall, snorted it, refocused, ran back to the entry, saw the Goatman/Skinwalker, who was now freaking the fuck out, and BAAING. Bony protrusions had cracked up through his spine. His clothes had almost ripped entirely off. The beast's chest now a hulking mass of muscle pulsating with anger, growing larger by the second. I ran past and booked it to my car. I threw my shit in the car, and my brain was on ultra speed. Would driving work? No, those things always catch up in the stories. Gun? Not my piece of shit. Fire? Fire would work. I grabbed my spare can of gas from my car, cheap gas in Canada. Stock up while you can. Booked it back, and hoped to God that thing hadn't regained its senses. When I entered the door, I realized it had, and it was pissed. The now-hugged monstrosity charged right at me, swiping with its claws. It grazed my side, sending searing pain through my synapses. I barely managed to hold onto the can of gas and tumbled into the bedroom, directly onto the bed. I was apparently bleeding more than the pain was telling me, because I slipped a bit in puddle of my own blood trying to flee to the opposite side of the bed, away from the monster now barreling through the doorway. I flipped the mattress with my sleeping bag up, and the thing started shredding it. It was making unholy screams now, like an elephant was giving birth to a goat that was being mauled by a lion. I managed to pour the gas onto the mattress with one hand, bracing the mattress between myself and the certain death right behind it. The goat beast didn't seem to care, getting covered in gasoline, mattress material, and sleeping bag foam. I let back on the mattress a little, just enough for it to push forward hard. Then I pushed back harder. So hard I broke my wrist. So hard I sprained both ankles. It didn't expect the life and death Hulk strength and flinched for only a second, but I used that second of fear and drug-induced time dilation to smash through the window behind me. Without even thinking, I flicked open my lighter and threw it in the window. Within a second, the room was up in flames. After I ran to the curb, I looked back inside. What I saw in the window was my proudest moment. The monster was engulfed in flames. Not only had the gasoline caught, but the foam and other material had stuck to it and was rapidly searing off skin and muscle. The thing was screaming. It was dying. It was the most metal thing I had ever seen. I took a sigh of relief, then noticed a cool feeling on my leg. I looked down to find an absurd pool of blood under me. The pain hit. I passed out. I woke up in the hospital. Apparently, firefighters had found me. I told the police a semi-lie about being a squatter and having someone come at me with a knife, and when I was out, they must have started the fire. I was eventually discharged, found my way back to the house, and got in my car. Then I got the hell out of Detroit. So that's how I killed a skinwalker, or a go-man, whatever you want to call that thing. Yeah, I almost died, but I didn't. Is there a lesson from this? Yes, and here it is because I like to share my opinions. Monsters have to hide in the dark because they're afraid of us. Maybe not individually, but they must have seen what we're able to accomplish as a group. We will turn land bare for resources, create weapons that could annihilate all life, and shoot ourselves in metal tubes into space. We're smart and vicious, and no matter how good any beast gets at murdering, humans have mastered the art. I don't know how to end this triumphant speech, so I am just going to stop writing now. Okay, now. Alright, maybe one more sentence. Wait, I almost forgot the classic. Fifth story. This story was shared by you /Harrison_Prince. My camping trip with my dad was ruined. My dad and I were going camping for a weekend just to spend some time together. This was last year, and it was my first year of college. Everything was stressing me out, and since we'd gone camping together a few times in the past, my dad was nice enough to take some time off and bring me out. The campsite was 2 hours away, so the sparse trees turned gradually into deep forest. While we followed the road as it wound through canyons and around mountainsides, I remember thinking how awesome the density of the trees was. I mean, you couldn't see beyond a few feet. It was just like the movies, and I never remembered seeing the density like this. We got to the campsite feeling cramped and happy to be in fresh air. Together, we pitched the tent first and set up our sleeping bags so it would be ready for us when we were tired. Since we had left so early in the day, it was still light out, so we took the truck and drove to the nearby lake to throw in some bait and just hang out. No one else was there since it was a weekday. That meant we didn't have to fight for a spot or hike halfway around the lake to settle in. We walked to a ledge just off a trail that was near the road, set down our camping chairs, and set up our fishing gear. Dad's into audiobooks, so he pulled out a speaker and put on a mystery novel. We'd talk occasionally, but having the book on play helped us feel like we were connecting without being forced to find topics of conversation. We still had all weekend. We took turns walking the trail a ways, seeing what was further along the lake. The forest was behind us and sloped uphill after a little while. The whole lake was inside a bowl surrounded by hills and mountains. It was seriously beautiful. As the sun was getting close to setting on the bowl, a long, drawn-out booming moan echoed across the lake. It was sudden too. Silence, then moaning. It lasted for several seconds before abruptly stopping. The echo made it impossible to identify where it had come from. The moan bounced back and forth around the bowl, lasting 2 seconds longer than the actual sound had been. My dad hit the pause button immediately and we stared at each other, first scared, then confused. The best I can describe it is the sound of a wail in pain, only above the water and very, very loud. The sound was deep too, so deep that it pressed noticeably on my eardrums. Something big had compressed and released all the air in the entire valley. I asked my dad what that noise was, and he just shook his head. We waited for a few more seconds, cocking our heads and subconsciously prompting whatever it was to make a noise again so we could identify it. When nothing happened, we both chuckled at each other and joked about it. My heart was still pounding pretty hard, but I began to relax. We reeled in our hooks and started putting everything away. I was arranging everything in the tackle box when the booming moan came again. I watched everything in the box make a noticeable jump, as if a gust of wind had swept across the whole box. I remember looking up at my dad, wondering what sound could do that, and I saw him looking out over the lake. I managed to turn around with enough time to see something big sink below the tree lean across the lake. It was a lighter color, though I'm not sure what color I would describe it being. The trees around it all swayed heavily, looking like they might fall over. But they didn't. They just swung back and forth after being disturbed. Another booming moan, this one causing actual ripples in the lake. Small, short ripples, like placing sand on a speaker plate and watching it dance while a song played. Except the plate was the size of a lake, and the entire surface was disturbed. The sound must have been partially below our hearing range, because if not, it's a miracle our eardrums didn't burst. Without even discussing it, we threw everything into the tackle box and walked quickly to the truck. We were both on edge, looking over our shoulder at the edge of the lake and waiting to see if anything else would appear. Another truck was pulling into the lot as we put our poles into the trunk. Seeing someone else calmed us both a little, and I could tell my dad was relieved to not have to be the complete adult authority now. It was two guys coming to fish, both older than my dad. They caught us looking at them and nodded. We nodded back, realizing that we were staring with wide eyes. I jumped when the boom sounded again. You could hear the water churning under the strain. My dad jumped too when it came, and while it was still going on, we got into the truck and started it. The moan ended after we were driving away. The two guys who had arrived were putting their stuff back into their truck in a panic. While we drove back to the campsite, I was drumming my fingers on my leg and just feeling a complete panic come over me. I've read since then that some super low frequency sounds below our hearing range can cause sound-induced panic. I'm convinced that's what was going on. While driving, I thought I heard yet another moan rattle the windows and shake the truck, but that could have been the fear adding that sensation. Our campsite was 10 minutes away, but that's because the roads were winding and the speed limit was slow. We could still see part of the lake from our spot, so we weren't that far from the lake. Dad made the unilateral decision to leave, even though we'd only just arrived. I was fine with that. My heart was racing and wouldn't stop. We rolled up our sleeping bags and tossed them into the truck. Just as we were taking the poles out of the tent, a less intense but still terrifying moan echoed up the mountainside, coming unequivocally from the lake. The echo rattled around the trees for a long time, longer than is natural. Usually the trees would absorb and dampen it, but the sound just kept rattling around until it wore itself out. If you were floating underwater and took a huge spear and stabbed it into the side of a whale, the water would sound like what we heard. A boom as the water compacted and a tinge of desperation and pain on the fringes resulting in a higher pitch. And if you were deep in near the floor of the ocean, you'd hear it bounce back at you again, a shadow of the sound but still equally horrifying. We smashed the fabric of the tent together, tossed the whole thing into the truck bed, and got in. Dad went too fast trying to leave. The truck's engine was still too loud to determine if we were still hearing the moan, but the panic that it induced made us unwilling to stick around and investigate. Looking back, I wish we had stayed and investigated, but at the time I was happy just to leave. Sixth story. This story was shared by you/Phoenix_flies. I witnessed a horrific ritual in the woods. A stone circle sits in the ancient oak woods behind my house. A dozen large rocks, positioned in a pattern that could be no accident. One is carved into a sort of throne. One sits upon two others to form an arch, echoing the formations at Stonehenge, a mere hour's drive away. I used to play there with my older brother until he was tragically taken from us. Perhaps too young to fully comprehend his loss, I returned to the stone circle daily, playing with my imaginary friend in his stead. Doghead was the name I gave him, inspired by a rather obvious feature my young imagination had conjured up. In my mind's eye, he had the energy and affection of a puppy, and he was as close a companion as a lonely young boy could ever hope for. We used to play for hours, safe in the knowledge that home was the only house for miles. My parents were distant and self-absorbed throughout my childhood, and the loss of their eldest son, their golden boy, only turned them colder. They were whisked away to join him by a devastating car accident when I was 19. The house, the surrounding land, and the stone circle in the woods, it was suddenly all mine. It was finally as empty as it had always felt. Those first few years were strange. I had been relatively self-sufficient for as long as I could remember, so my day-to-day life changed little after they died. I worked the same job, writing copy for websites and magazines from home. I ate the same food, groceries delivered weekly. It took a long time to get used to living without their influence, without their perpetual misery. As time went by, I became more comfortable in my own skin. I left behind the cowering, appeasing child. I shrugged off the expectations and the aura of constant disappointment. I started learning who I was, and I grew to like it. And I forgot about the stone circle in the woods behind the house. The forest itself is sparse. Each wizened oak tree stands at a respectful distance from the others, as if honoring some ancient acorn pact. Their high canopies dominate the sky, permitting precious little sunlight to filter through their leaves. Below, the prime soil was claimed by their web of roots long ago, leaving few resources for competing flora. The only bushes daring enough to challenge the monopoly of these giants are holly and gorse, their sharp leaves offering refuge to songbirds and scavengers alike. Sparse though these woods are, they are far from lifeless. At night, however, the woods don a deathly disguise. Save for the eerie breeze shuffle of the leafy canopy, an unnatural stillness hangs between the trunks like a thick fog. The distance between each oak lends a feeling of being exposed to all directions, carrying light further than might be expected, which is how I was first enticed by the glimmers I saw from my bathroom window. Half asleep and wishing to be fully so, I had neglected to turn on the bathroom light. If I had so much as flipped that switch, the subtle flickering outside would have gone unnoticed. The horrors of the night now seared into my mind would have gone without witness, and I would soon have fallen asleep safe and untroubled. Instead, I slapped myself awake and threw together a dark outfit, pocketing a torch. In an instant, I was 12 years old again, preparing for an imaginary stealth mission, sneaking out under the cover of darkness, taking care not to step on even a single twig, partly in commitment to the scene, and partly from fear of the retribution from my parents should I be caught. Both then and now, the fear mixed with excitement to produce the most irresistible cocktail, and I crept into the woods without hesitation. I advanced steadily as my eyes adjusted to the gloom. Every step was measured, every motion a calculated risk. Roots could be trip hazards. The snap of dry branches could give me away. A dirt hole from badger or fox habitation could spell a sprained ankle or worse. I kept my breathing deep and steady, preparing to run at a moment's notice. Peering around trunks as I pressed into the woods, I followed the light while keeping to the shadows. As it drew me on, I realized it must originate from more than a single source. I pictured a forest fire, but there was no smell of smoke, no crackle of caught bark. A bizarre sound made me stop dead, pressing my back against the nearest tree. It was deep, guttural, and reminded me of videos I'd seen of Mongolian throats singing. The low vocal rumble rolled through the forest, several voices combined into a loud and stirring chord, which I felt take a firm hold of my ribcage. As suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I listened intently for any other sound and could faintly hear a single voice, monotone and slow, but I couldn't make out the syllables. I peeked cautiously around the oak and began deeper into the woods. It wasn't long until I saw the source of the light. Dozens and dozens of blazing torches, easily 100 or more, each mounted on a stake driven into the ground at an angle, the flames directed outwards as if to ward off the forest itself. The torches formed a wide circle in a clearing, within which stood a host of robed figures, heads lowered. Each crimson robe was uniformly embellished with gold borders and detailing, mirroring the flames that danced around them. I saw the torches first, then the people. Then I saw the stones, and my breath caught in my throat. The gathering had taken place on the ancient playground of my youth, within the stone circle I had long since forgotten. Far from respectful occupiers, however, for of these cloaked intruders were painting symbols and sigils onto the bare, pure rocks, a bucket of red in one hand and a paintbrush in the other. A network of circles, curves and crossed lines already adorned most of the rocks. They were nearly finished with their task. I watched them corrupting my childhood one brushstroke at a time, and fought hard not to yell. This felt like both a deeply personal attack and a sacrilegious transgression all at once. I wept in silence as I watched them complete their work. I was struck by a vivid memory of my brother sat in the chair-carved stone, bending to tap a stick onto each of my shoulders in turn. He was king that day, and I was being knighted to protect the realm. For hours, he would point out imaginary invaders and threats to the kingdom, all trying to break into the sacred space of the stone circle, and I would charge into battle, bellowing as best a boy of 7 could, swinging a branch to fend off foes on all sides. I chided my childish stupidity. When outnumbered, as I was last night, self-preservation comes first. Bravado without caution would be suicide. One of these interlopers was standing on my brother's throne, arms outstretched, addressing the others like a priest leading a congregation. His was the voice I had heard, though too quiet to discern from where I stood. I had to get closer. The group was focused on his speech, I reasoned, and any subtle motion I made in the shadows of the forest would likely be lost among the flickering torches. Light on my feet, I pressed even closer, crouching to take cover beneath the spikes of a holly bush with an oak to my side. I was mere feet from the edge of the clearing, but confident in my concealed position. No further, I told myself, either remain or retreat. I was close enough to hear the speech, but its meaning was lost to me. It clearly wasn't English, but sounded like no language I had ever heard. There was a guttural, stern tone to it, almost Germanic, but the syllables weren't recognizably German either. Percussive sounds punctuated the phrases, sometimes a click, sometimes a hacking noise like the speaker was clearing his throat. The structure of the speech was alien to me, and although I couldn't hope to comprehend its meaning, I was enraptured. It felt as if he was speaking from beyond himself, from somewhere far older than any tongues remembered or recorded, channeling verses written before writing. The crowd was similarly captivated, hanging from his every utterance, all except the 4 painters and one man in the middle. This man, I saw, was unrobed. Rather, he was naked and kneeling, his wrists bound behind his back, eyes wide with impassioned pleading as the priest figure continued. His head was shaking back and forth, as if to deny every utterance of the speech. The scene put me in mind of a trial, perhaps for some pagan or shamanic cult. I know little of such beliefs and values, having led such an insular life, so I had no real frame of reference, but the whole display felt sinister and sickened me. It came again, the sound which had shocked me earlier, that low, rumbling chord, now revealed to originate from the throats of the entire congregation acting as one, triggered by something the throned figure had said. He sliced a hand through the air, and the tone ceased immediately. Another hand gesture, and it began afresh, a slice, and it stopped. This on and off routine repeated, its conductor picking up the pace steadily from labored to frenzied. The bound man was clearly terrified, his pleading eyes darting from figure to figure, each swept up in this guttural chanting crescendo. Dark red streaks painted his face, from his eyes down to his chin. With a final swipe of the priest's arm, the group fell silent. A beckon of his hand, and two of the hooted flock hauled the bound man to his feet, dragging him towards the stone chair. I could hear him straining and groaning through closed lips. As he was brought before the priest, I saw his mouth had been sewn shut with a tight web of cord, his lips turned inwards. Those red tear streaks he wore were colored by dried blood, his wide eyes unable to close without their lids. This group, or cult, had taken morbid steps to prevent him from screaming or looking away. The leader of the ceremony drew a short dagger, holding it skywards, flames glinting off the blade. The man protested as best he could, but was flanked and held in place by taller, stronger figures. In two quick motions, an X was traced across his bare chest, the wounds shallow and scarlet bright. The crowd shifted suddenly at this, surging towards the throne. Hands were all over the man in an instant, carrying him back and away, ignoring his feeble writhing and muffled screams. A divide had formed in the clearing, bisecting the stone circle. On one side, the cult, some of whom had picked up torches and were brandishing them. On the other side, the man, kicked to the floor and struggling to stand with his hands still bound. Flames were turned on him, keeping him at bay from the group. Behind him, the stone archway loomed, a gateway to the gloom of the woods. A gap had been deliberately left in the circle of torchlight. The leader bellowed out a three-syllable chant in that strange language, which was eagerly echoed back by his flock. He repeated the phrase, louder, rousing the crowd. This back and forth exchange continued, building in volume and speed towards a raw cacophony. When there was scarce a pause between call and response, the priest handed the reins to chaos, the clamor of the crowd drowning the forest in a tide of sound. Feet were stomping. Arms were waved. Frenzied dances broke out. One member of the congregation passed out. They were unceremoniously rolled to the side of the circle and abandoned in favor of the growing noise. I lay flat under the holly bush with my hands clamped over my ears. Such was the sheer volume before me. As painful as the sound was to bear, I couldn't help but find their primal passion compelling. I should have left them to their devices. I should have made a break for home while they were so deeply distracted. They stopped, as one, falling completely silent. The sense of euphoric elation had collapsed, giving way to a nervous foreboding. Heads turned anxiously from side to side. The group huddled, gathering in closer towards the stone chair. The bound man was making his way towards them on his knees, straining to force pleas through stitched lips, but was kept back by the torchbearers. They seemed intent on pushing him towards the archway, towards the looming dark of the forest. Someone in the crowd noticed something in the forest behind the bound man, pointing a finger beyond the circle, past the stone arch, into the tree lane. Their extended arm was quickly pulled down by other hands, as if chided by the group. Regardless, a tangible excitement overtook the gathering. Murmurs broke out, whispers and gasps. They pressed back, even further away from the bound man and the stone archway behind him, I strained my eyes to see beyond the flames, seeing nothing but shifting shadows. As I looked back to the crowd, however, I saw it. A tall figure emerged from the trees, its outline only clear from the corner of my eyes as they struggled to adjust to the dark. It appeared as though the shadow of a tree had come to life, standing at least 8 or 9 feet tall. I couldn't see where its height ended. It swept stiffly towards the clearing as if carried by invisible ropes. There was no motion of walking. This giant shadow floated. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, where it should have been bathed in torchlight. Instead, it was a void, a vertical black hole, seeming to drain the light from the woods around it. As I tried to make sense of what I was witnessing, this floating shadow was passed by a second. They moved alternately. One stopped as the other advanced, carried in sweeping motions. As they drew nearer to the stone circle, the bound man turned his begging towards them, throwing himself down, his blood-stained face against the thin grass, his frame racked with wretched sobs. He was hoping or praying for mercy. None came. Without warning, his torso was wrapped in giant fingers of that same vacant darkness. He was snatched through the archway and barely a breath, out towards the treeline, and lifted high over the stones. His legs kicked at the air, finding no purchase. As he was held aloft, I gleaned a sense of the scale of the creature before me. It was, I now saw, a single entity. What I had identified as 2 figures earlier were merely its shins. It stood on 2 legs, looming over the stone circle, one huge hand resting atop the archway. Light failed to adhere to its form, offering only a silhouette to interpret against the backdrop of torchlit oaks. It had moved in complete silence, despite its size. Though vast, it seemed to share the limbs and proportions of a human, with one notable exception. I felt my heart stop dead as I looked up into the canopy of leaves and recognized the outline of a forgotten figure from my own past, looming over the stone circle in which we had played so long ago. I clamped my hands over my mouth to keep the shock within. I had grown a lot over the past 20 years, inside and out. It seemed that Doghead had grown even more. The cultists had by now dropped to their knees, every head bowed in silent reverence. A uniform stillness had come over them, likely born from both respect and fear, and they had good reason for the latter. The naked man, their sacrifice, was held aloft by Doghead with both hands, those massive pitch-black fingers clasped around his legs and his torso. He strained to scream as the creature tightened its grip and twisted. Something gave out with a crunch, his rib cage and pelvis rotating in different directions. Blood spewed from his mouth as his lips parted in spite of the stitches, bellowing his pain freely now through torn curtains of scarlet. As his body bent, his skin broke around his midriff, yellow fat parting to give way to a cascade of entrails. He was divided, his scream failing as his diaphragm dropped. Doghead was elated, raising the drooping organs above its head, opening its enormous jaws and directing the offal inside. Even while consuming its prey, no sound came from the shadow monster itself. The man was just barely clinging onto life, gasping breathlessly, his eyes darting around in panic as dark teeth the size of his forearm clamped down on what remained of his torso, gnawing like living jerky. Fighting to divert my gaze from this atrocity, I looked towards the lowered heads of the cult and saw more shoulders shaking than still. They were deeply afraid, that much was clear. Even the throned figure who had led the ritual was kneeling on the stone seat, head bowed and trembling. A sudden gasp erupted from the crowd. The cultist who had passed out earlier had awoken and was looking around, bleary and sluggish. Some members of the group had noticed and were trying to encourage them to their knees, but they were resistant in their barely conscious state. Doghead dropped its snack, staring fiercely as this poor fool staggered to their feet. The creature's eyes were previously indistinguishable from the great canine shadow of its head, but now they shone a piercing white, small and blazing. This accidental indignity from the dazed cultist had changed something in Doghead. Swiftly but silently it swept an arm towards the ground, extinguishing a dozen of the protective torches around the stone circle with a single motion. There was a brief moment of profound quiet, as those gathered seemed to process what had just happened. The quenched torches breathed the last of their smoke. A second of foreboding stillness hung heavy in the night air, and then pandemonium. The crowd fell about themselves, shrieking in terror, scrambling over one another in all directions, eschewing reverence for pure panic. Doghead didn't hesitate, lunging into the stone circle, no longer held back. It was absolutely silent in its motion, a flawless predator. It bounded towards the hapless transgressor and effortlessly snatched them from the ground. The staggering cultist hardly had chance to gasp before Doghead snapped their chin up and back with a single thumb, separating their skull from the rest of their spine without splitting the skin. Their body fell limp instantly and was dropped to the ground. My legs were aching to carry me away from the scene, but I knew I had to stay put. Not only would I be a target for the shadow monster, but potentially for the cultists. The worst wounds I would receive from my vantage point under the bush would be scrapes and bruises, so there I remained, quaking though I was. The ritual leader was the first to abandon the stone circle altogether, sprinting straight into the woods without looking back, not sparing a moment's thoughts for their flock. The others followed suit in a staggered wave, clearly caught between the protection they believed would hold firm in the vulnerable darkness of the forest. Having claimed 2 victims, Doghead turned its attention to the remaining flames. It lumbered around the edge of the stone circle, sweeping its palm over the torches. They went out without exception, either blown by displaced air through the motion of that huge hand, or perhaps smothered by the shadows that formed this creature. As the last of the lights disappeared, so too did Doghead, its void outline no longer visible against trees that once again stood dark and still. It had reclaimed its cover of night, its motion barely perceptible as the faintest suggestion through leaf-filtered starlight, and it sped away into the gloom. The cult had dispersed, their footfalls and shrieks gradually diminishing to nothing. The circle was silent once again, almost tranquil, save for the scrawled seagulls on the stones. I lay still beneath the holly bush until dawn broke and beyond, making certain that no shadows remained to ambush me before I scrambled out to make my way home. In daylight, I can see that the remains of the 2 victims claimed by Doghead had disappeared in the hours since their slaughter. The creature had managed to remove them both, and I hadn't even noticed its presence. As I write this, I am profoundly conflicted, struck by a heady mix of abject terror and giddy revelation. I'm shaking, shocked to the core by what I witnessed. A monster he may be, but he was once my closest friend, one I thought lost to the passing years and the maturing mind. Before sundown, I will return to the circle and wash those stones clean. It feels disrespectful to leave them so sullied and stained. After all, for better or for worse, I am no longer alone. 7th story. This story was shared by you / Kessel the Viking. My best friend the Wendigo. Sometimes things happen to us that we just cannot explain. No matter how many resources are available or what information we can find. There are things that can never be understood, and that is a commanding factor of life. Now, a question. I know some, if not many of you have had friends, even best friends that disappear from your life without a rhyme or reason. That very same thing happened to me with my friend Marcus. We were best friends throughout high school and carried the friendship on well into our 20s, but one day he simply disappeared. I don't mean he was reported missing and the police were involved. I just mean he left without telling me, his best friend. I spoke to his mother, and she said he had gone on a trip to northern Alaska. When I asked her why, she said, he never gave me a reason. I could hear the sorrowful tone in her voice. Like myself, She missed him too. But out of nowhere he came back. He told no one he had returned, and one day he showed up on my doorstep as if he had never left. I admit he looked good, better than I remembered. He seemed healthy, if you can understand. "Marcus, you're back," I remarked, bewildered. "Yeah, man," he said in a smooth demeanor. He had his hands tucked into the pockets of the jean jacket he was wearing. "Got back a couple days ago. You look well. Where have you been, man?" I asked casually. I noticed his face was flushed red, but it was probably just the lighting outside because the sun was setting. "Yeah, thanks. I've just been traveling, finding myself," he answered, but he seemed indifferent about conversation. It made me wonder why he came here if he wasn't looking to talk. "Well, that's cool. Did you want to come in?" I asked while gesturing my hand through the door. He nodded and brushed past me into my home. "Thanks, Derek," he said nonchalantly, as if this was a routine occurrence. "Something up?" I asked as I closed the door behind me. Marcus flipped his wavy blonde hair and sighed. "No, not really. I just have a proposition for you." It was strange that this was how he decided to start the first conversation between us in a long time. A proposition? Forgive me for saying this, but we haven't spoken in quite some time, man, and I don't know if I'm really in the position to dive headfirst into something new. "No, it's not like that," began Marcus. He didn't appear slighted by my response, which was welcoming to see. "I was just wondering if you'd be interested in coming with me on a trip. A vacation of sorts. It wouldn't be long, just a week up north." "With who?" "You," I asked with a hint of scrutiny. "Yeah, just me," he said quickly. For some reason, his fingers were twitching like he could barely control himself from having a breakdown of some kind. "Why so sudden? And why me?" "I mean, Marcus, where have you actually been this whole time? I find it strange you would come to me of all people for this hurried request of yours. I need someone to come with me. It's important that you understand, Derek. I'm not the same person I was when I left. I am something much more unique. But I cannot be left to the masses. I must be quelled." He was speaking in completely vague sentences, the context of which I couldn't understand. "I have to be honest with you, Marcus. I don't know what the fuck you're saying to me right now." I wasn't going to lie, but I saw a slight shift in his eyes upon hearing my candor. He sat down in my recliner and clasped his hands together. "Listen, are you in or not?" He wouldn't even look me in the face when he asked. He simply hung his head with his eyes on the floor. "Well, I don't know. Where would we be going exactly?" "A cabin up north. Once we get there, I'll give you a list of instructions that you must adhere to. I promise you will understand." I took a deep breath. Clearly, Marcus was in distress and needed help. I wasn't going to leave him to fend off against whatever demons were riding his shoulders. I figured he had become an addict and wanted someone to look after him while he got himself cleaned up. "I suppose," I said quietly. "Awesome. Thanks, Derek," he said hastily. "You won't have to pay for anything. I've got that all covered. Just be ready tomorrow morning, and we will head up there." "Tomorrow? Damn, that's definitely short notice," I said, already thinking about what I would tell my boss. "Don't worry about work, man. Just trust me, even if you've never trusted anyone," he remarked as if he read my mind. He then stood up and began walking to the door. "I don't know what happened to you, but something's definitely different," I mentioned as I opened the door for him. "You don't know the half of it," he said before walking outside. "See you in the morning. Bring anything you're comfortable with bringing, but don't overpack." I nodded even though he was facing away from me, and he walked off down the sidewalk. How'd he got here? Obviously, he didn't drive if he was walking. Something seriously weird was going on with him. My boss was fine with me taking some time off. I figured it wouldn't actually last a week anyway, so in my head all would be well. The next morning, I was ready to go, and Marcus arrived just after 9 a.m. to pick me up. I brought my things outside. I had only packed some snacks, a flashlight, blankets, a pillow, my medication, and several outfits for the outdoors alive. "The cabin has beds and blankets," said Marcus from the driver's seat of the old SUV he arrived in. "Yet, well, I prefer to feel a sense of comfort that I can only achieve by having things that belong to me." "If you say so," he remarked. His lack of engagement was already growing stale. I got in the passenger seat and we sped away without another word shared between us. Every so often, I would glance at Marcus to study him. While he did seem healthy, there was something innately different about him that I couldn't put my finger on. He was jittery, easily startled, and on edge. We drove for a good 6 hours before pulling off at a rest area. Marcus seemed alert, but for some reason he said, "We're going to sleep here for the night." "The night? Have you gone blind, dude? It's barely 3 in the afternoon." "Yes, I know. I'm hungry and I need to rest," said Marcus quietly. "I can drive, man, if that's the issue," I asked reassuringly. He turned to look at me with viciously bloodshot eyes as if he had been staring at the sun the entire drive. "No, you don't know the way. You can tell me the way? I have GPS?" "No, Derek. Just close your eyes or do something for a bit. I'm hungry." The way he said hungry was like a ravenous animal, like his desire to feed was overthrowing his decision-making. Fine. Go get something to eat then," I said, kicking my feet up on the dash and leaning the seat back. Marcus stammered when he responded, "No, not yet. When night falls, I will." "You're acting really strange, man. Is everything good?" Instead of responding, he only nodded slowly. I didn't say anything back, but I did watch him from the corner of my eye for some time. I noticed he was watching every single person who walked into the rest stop, like a starving fiend. I passed the time by reading on my phone, listening to music through my headphones, and after night fell, I closed my eyes. Up until I decided to try and sleep, Marcus hadn't taken his eyes off the entrance of the rest stop. I can't even recall if I saw him blink once. Luckily, I managed to fall asleep relatively quickly. However, I was awoken abruptly when Marcus heaved his body back into the driver's seat as if he were running from something. He was absolutely covered in blood, his mouth and most of his face, his hands, his shirt and pants, everywhere. "And Marcus, what the fuck, man?" I asked intensely. He swallowed audibly. "I feel better now. We can keep going." I could see his teeth stained red from the dim light produced by the rest area. "No way, man. You're going to tell me what happened to you." Without looking at me, he said, "I had to eat, Derek. We all have to eat." "What in the fuck are you talking about, Marcus? What did you eat? A barrel of blood?" "Not quite." He then started the vehicle and shifted it into reverse. I reached out and shifted it back into park. When I did, he turned towards me and grabbed my wrist. His grip was insurmountably strong. It felt like he could crush my arm if he had the mind to do it. "Derek, let go," was all he said while his entire body was visibly trembling. I didn't know what else to do, so I listened. I carefully brought my hand back to my lap, and he shifted into reverse once more before bringing us back onto the freeway. I couldn't keep my eyes off him, but he wouldn't look at me anymore. Not until we reached the cabin. The overwhelming smell of blood had filled the vehicle, and I had gagged a few times from it. The pungent aroma wafting off Marcus was almost unbearable. I checked my phone. Of course, there was no signal out here, and I caught a glimpse of him watching me from the other side of the SUV. "Calling the police is futile," said Marcus through his blood-stained teeth. "Tell me what you did back there." I shouted at him, unsure of what else to say. "I did what I had to," he said while walking towards the front door of the cabin. "Marcus, please, man. I can help. Just tell me what's going on." He froze as if he really was about to answer me, but instead he reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. Then he unlocked the door and went in without saying another word. I stood outside for a long time. I didn't want to go inside and see him sitting there painted with blood, but something told me that Marcus needed help, so I went in. He was sitting on a dusty couch in fresh clothes. He must have showered too, because his skin was clear of the red tinge that had dominated it before. One thing was different, though. He had lost most of his hair. I don't mean little clumps or bald spots. I mean there were only a few strands of hair remaining. Furthermore, he had patches of raw skin on his face, and I'm sure they were on his body as well. I sat in a chair across from him and observed his seemingly deteriorating form. His eyes were fixed on the rickety floorboards beneath us, and he had his palms placed flat on his thighs. After 5 solid minutes without so much as a twitch, he finally raised his head. His eyes met mine, but his were almost black. There were dark blue veins forming a web pattern from the corners of his eye sockets, and his lips were dry and cracked. When he spoke, it was with a breathy and raspy tone. "I'm going to tell you a story, Derek. When I am finished, you will do something for me. You cannot say no. You must do it. I can't make Promi dash." "You must." Marcus suddenly shouted. He had raised himself up further, but something wasn't right. His spine was longer somehow, like it had been stretched, making him appear much taller even when sitting down. Okay, I said timidly. His shouting struck a drastically fearful chord within me. "Good." He mumbled under his breath. Then he began his story. "As you know, I went to Alaska. It wasn't for nothing. I had actually met a girl up there on an app." He grinned slightly, but it quickly faded. When I say this, I mean it. She was perfect. Well, for me at least. He stopped for a moment, and I noticed he was eyeing my hands, but then he continued. "Anyway, her name was Claire, and we really hit it off. It was one of those love at first sight moments. Seriously, Derek, she was everything I could have ever wanted or needed in a woman." I uttered a sound of acknowledgement, so he knew I was listening as he went on. "She was a simple person, and she lived in an old town. I can't even remember the name of it now, but we made a life for ourselves there. However, she started acting strange. She would ask to have guests over constantly as if I wasn't enough. I don't say that in a jealous way. I mean, she literally wanted someone else over every single day, and she reeked of desperation. It was like her life depended on it." While he spoke, one of his fingernails fell off and landed with a quiet ticking sound on the floor. Marcus didn't seem to mind because he kept talking. Eventually, I caved. I invited one of her friends over, a local guy who worked at the town's bakery. About an hour before he arrived, Claire called me into the bedroom. She had this weird, almost evil tone in her voice, but I disregarded it. I thought that she may have been looking to get intimate before this friend of hers arrived, but that wasn't the case at all. "Are you sick, Marcus?" I asked as I watched 2 more fingernails slide off his fingers onto the floor. He didn't answer me, not directly anyway. He looked up at me, and his left eye clouded over with a milky white color. Was he dying right before me? Marcus picked at one of the scaly gray patches of skin on his hand. It only made his other nails fall off, but he didn't seem to mind or notice because he went on. As I entered our bedroom, the door closed behind me. Claire was standing there with a rope and a gag. That only solidified my assumption about her need for intimacy, so I let her tie me up. But instead of getting frisky, she gagged me and left the room. I tried to get her attention, but obviously she couldn't hear me. "How long were you like that?" I asked gently. I wanted him to feel like I had genuine interest. "Longer than I expected." I heard her friend come inside, and I tried to yell to get his attention, but it was no use. That's when the screams started. There were horrendous noises of agony coming from the other room, and they weren't from Claire. He sighed again faintly. During the conversation, his entire body had begun turning a pale gray color, and the last bits of hair he had left fell to the floor. There was this squelching sound and another sound I can only liken to a saw cutting meat. I hated every moment being tied to that bed in our barely lit room. Where are you going with all of this, Marcus? Are you saying Claire killed her friend? She didn't just kill him, Derek. She ate him. What? I exclaimed vehemently as my stomach turned. Yeah, she ate him, and when she was full, she brought the scraps of what was left into the bedroom. She removed the gag and told me if I didn't eat, she would consume my flesh as well. Did you do it? I asked with curiosity. He looked down and then up before slowly nodding. I did. Marcus. Man, I don't know what to say. Just keep listening. He said solemnly. I had to hold my mouth open while she let the blood of her friend drip inside. She told me that if I did, then I'd never be sick again. I'd never worry about anything but eating. It made me remember all the times she had gone out for the night only to come back looking more youthful than before. I shifted in the chair and Marcus stared at my hands again for far too long. I was growing uncomfortable by his lustful gaze. The next time he spoke, his voice had diminished into something gravelly and hoarse. I did not fight her. I did what she asked. I hoped that she had just lost her mind, and when she was satisfied, I'd make my escape. But I was wrong. The flesh, that is, the consumption of it made me a new being. It gave me strength, vitality, and an iron constitution. I felt the best I had ever felt in years, but then came the hunger. Hunger? I questioned calmly, although I was reminded of when he mentioned how hungry he was at the rest area. Yes, Derek. The hunger for human flesh was insatiable. It didn't matter how much I ate. My body would feel like it had been further deprived of sustenance. I craved warm, running blood, almost like a vampire, and Claire did too. Before we knew it, we had slaughtered the entire town and nobody saw it coming. But after that, Claire, she turned into something feral, something less human and more animalistic. Like you are now? I asked with a hint of concern. Yes, she became this creature. It was grotesque and malformed. She wasn't my Claire anymore. So, I did what any loving partner would do. I put her out of her misery. You killed her. I ended her suffering. I see. That's when I came back down here. I couldn't live up there alone, but I also realized I couldn't be left alive at all. Derek, I desperately want to be with Claire again, whether there's still a place for my soul in heaven or if I'll be sentenced to an eternal hell for the things I've done. As long as Claire's there, I'll be happy. What are you saying exactly, Marcus? I want you to kill me. You, what? I admit, I chuckled a little because the notion was ridiculous. I want you to take the shotgun out of the gun safe and blow my fucking head off so I can't devour another innocent person. Marcus was being serious. I could tell by his tone, and the longer this conversation went on, the more his body changed. I finally managed to ask the question I desperately wanted to know the answer to. Did you eat someone at the rest area? I ate an entire family, he said without remorse. I didn't know what to say. What could you say? All I could do was gasp while remaining at a loss for words. I called the police from the pay phone afterwards, so they should be there now. He began harshly. I chose that particular rest area because the cameras don't work. I had staked it out before even coming to you. It was all planned. But I did it for you. For me. You ate an entire family for me. No, I mean, I made it so you couldn't be connected to what happened. The police are none the wiser, and in reality, you've done nothing wrong. This is fucked up, Marcus. I know. I'm sorry, Derek. I need you to honor my request now, though, before it's too late. What happens if I don't? I asked out of curiosity. Marcus stood up hulkingly tall and groaned a bellowing, low, rumbling roar. You cannot deny my desire for death. In my pain, like I ended the pain for Claire. His breathing was rapid and fierce, but he managed to calm himself down. I apologize for scaring you, he said in his gruff voice. Marcus, you were my best friend once. I can't kill you. You have to. This is why I came to you, because you still are my best friend, and I didn't want to ask a random stranger. They wouldn't understand, but you can understand. His face grew long, and it was accompanied by many painful grunts by Marcus. I need you to do this for me. I do not want to hurt anyone else. Even now the hunger calls to me. It is taking every ounce of strength I have left to resist lashing out at you and devouring every tasty morsel of flesh covering your ripe and ravishingly delicious body. He shook his head like a madman before his eyes met mine once again. Please, Derek, I am begging you. I don't know what changed in me, but hearing my once best friend pleading for his death no longer perturbed my emotions. I stared at his rapidly transforming body for an indeterminate amount of time before getting up and walking to the gun safe. It was already unlocked. He must have done that while I waited outside. I reached in and grabbed the only gun in the case, the shotgun Marcus had mentioned. I assumed it was already loaded. If Marcus had planned this much, then surely he planned that too. I walked back to the chair and sat down, and a gnarled, black-toothed grin spread on Marcus's veiny, gray face. Thank you, Derek. I can't live with myself any longer, and this is the best option. Do not take pity on me. Do not feel guilty or ashamed. Take pride in the fact that you have expelled a ruthless creature from this world. I pumped the shotgun and aimed it at his head. My heart was pounding and my hands were sweating. Oh, one more thing, he remarked. In the glove box of the SUV are my life savings. Take it all and do with it what you will. I ask that you never tell my mother about this, or anyone else. It will be our secret. He then took one last deep breath. Okay, I'm ready. Do it. Just as I was pulling the trigger, Marcus's body twisted and contorted into a far more disturbing visage, and as the shot rang throughout the cabin, his blood and viscera splattered against the couch, the floors, the walls, and even the ceiling. His painful shrieking stopped, and his body ceased all movements. It was over. I sat there with the shotgun in my lap, still aimed at Marcus's corpse for most of the day. I couldn't bring myself to get up, or do anything else but stare at my headless former best friend. Eventually, I found the will to stand. After I was on my wobbly 2 feet, I took a sheet from one of the bedrooms and draped it over Marcus. I searched the entire grounds of the cabin for a shovel because I wanted to bury him, but I couldn't find one. It was cold outside anyway, and I'm sure he wouldn't want me to die from digging his grave. I did, however, find some matches. It was the middle of winter, so I thought it would be better to just burn the cabin down. I didn't want Marcus's body to rot there on the cold couch, and as I dropped a lit match on it, the fabric immediately engulfed into a mighty blaze. I walked out of the cabin and got into the driver's seat of the SUV, and that's when I remembered Marcus had the keys. I couldn't help but laugh about the irony of it all. Marcus had left 10 grand in the glove box for me. I ended up having to hike down the driveway and up the road until someone stopped to pick me up. They drove me to the nearest town, Grand Marais, I think it was called. It was a small town, but the people were friendly. I rented a room at their local inn and have been here for 3 days just thinking about Marcus and what he went through. I thought about if I was responsible for the family he murdered and ate, but I had no idea what was going on at the time. I was only along for the ride until I had to play my part, my role in ending Marcus's painful life. If your best friend, or even friend returns to you after having been gone and without contact for years, be careful if they ask for you to take a trip with them. And always remember, the mysteries of the world can outweigh grounded reality. Nothing is as it seems, even Marcus. Be safe, everyone. I hope none of you look down on me. 8th story. This story was shared by you/Raptor Cavalry. There was 8 of you out there. Montana is a vast land of natural beauty, giant expanses of mountains, plains, and everything in between. But with this wide open land comes a lot of maintenance. Here, there is only one cop for every 126 square miles. This leaves some rural communities and neighborhoods to bind together for protection with our infamous gun-wielding ways. I was sitting on our back porch at something like 11 o'clock at night. There was a thunderstorm coming through, and every couple of seconds, it'd seem like daylight had come, if only for a moment. My deck overlooks a pond on the edge of my backyard, with a treehouse above it from my childhood. On a night like this, it was nice to stare at these things and remember. And as I'm looking out at the forest surrounding my house, lighting strikes to illuminate a figure, I thought I may have just been seeing things, but remain focused on that area until the sky is lit again. And once it does, my fear was finalized. The figure had moved closer to the house from the pond. Now, in my area, there had been a series of robberies, and with no one caught yet, I decided that this must be him. And so I grabbed my father and older brother from indoors and raced them outside. In hand, my father has a hunting rifle, my brother a revolver, and I a baseball bat. As we run outside, we see a flash and a shadow run across the forest and freeze facing towards us. Next flash, and he's running away into the woods. With another flash, this time with a much closer bang coming from my right, I see the muzzle light up and the ear-shattering cry of a .306, quickly followed by the screaming of profanities. My neighbors quickly come running, but moments later, guns in hand and serious looks on their face. They say they heard the gunshot and came to check if everything was all right. Soon more neighbors from further down the road came for the same reason. We tell them of the man and that we shot at him and go to investigate if we can find him. After assembling our 7 men into a line, we sweep the woods, finding his blood trail, but soon losing it to the night. We search for what seems to be an hour, hearing and seeing nothing but some coyotes and deer, and we return to my house. Upon arrival, my mother greets us in the garage and has cookies freshly baked on hand. She gives us each one, and as we nibble down on the delicious treats, my mom stands there utterly bewildered. My dad looks over to her and asks what's wrong. She has an extra cookie in her hand and recounts. There was 8 of you out there searching. My dad laughs, and we take it as a mistake, but still my mom swears all night that she double-checked to make sure, and that there were 8 men searching. The morning comes, and we go outside to see where that trail may have led us, had we not lost it. In the forest, we find the immediate blood where he must have been shot, and follow it. As we do, we find it loops back around to where we gathered with our neighbors, and a dried pool was there. We find that it goes in a sweeping motion back and forth through the woods. We find that it goes almost back to our garage before it darts off back into the woods. There was 8 of us out there. 9th story. This story was shared by you/Queen Meowco. The Wendigo. I am a fan of horror games. I don't play them, but I love watching my favorite YouTubers play them. In fact, my favorite YouTuber who used to play horror games is H2O Delirious. One of my favorite games that he played is Until Dawn. I love it because it deals with a cultural monster, the Wendigo. The Wendigo is a monster who craves for human flesh. Wendigos were once human, but because they started to eat human flesh, they turned into Wendigos. Wendigos are able to imitate other people's voices to trick their prey. Wendigos are able to hear heartbeats from miles away. They are also really fast. I am starting to go off topic due here is my story. I had my own experience with the Wendigo. I live in a small town near the forest. I won't reveal where the place is because I am still afraid that it is still there. A friend and I, a female girl that is a year younger than me, decided to walk in the forest by ourselves. There aren't any dangers in the forest since we were still close to town. We stumbled upon a 2-story, worn-down cabin while walked near the outskirts of town. Most of the second story was non-existent. It seemed strange that it was still up and no one torn it down. Before I was born, the people of this town torn down all buildings in the forest for reasons unknown. I tried asking my parents, but their response is that it was very difficult to aid people who lived in the forest. Anyway, my friend and I got very curious and decided to check it out. We were quiet upon entering the cabin, which now that I am looking back at it, I am very thankful that we were quiet. At the time we were quiet in case there was a homeless man sleeping or a dangerous person in there. It was still daytime when we were exploring, so we had plenty of light in the cabin, but there was one part of the cabin that was covered up. There was a black tarp that covered a doorway to some room. We never went near the doorway. We were both scared that we would get jumped by someone. My friend and I both agreed to stay clear of that area. Throughout the exploring, we both noticed that there was a faint, disgusting smell. The smell lingered only on the first floor. Although the reason is because since the second floor is open, the wind would blown off the smell away. Plus there must have been dead animals beneath the floorboards or something. It was only when we got near to the closed-off room did everything went downhill. Both my friend and I started to get a bit louder since we did not hear anybody in the building. When we got near the hallway of the room, the smell got drastically stronger. Then we both noticed that the tarp had moved ajar. The room was still too dark, but I could have sworn that there were a pile of bones. I noticed that my friend gotten slightly scared because neither one of us had gone 8 feet near the room. My first though was that someone was living here and that we should get out quietly in case the person was dangerous. I signaled my friend to be quiet and to follow me towards the back exit. As we were about to leave, we heard a familiar voice. I looked at my friend and I could see in her face confusion. Then it spoke again. It was calling for help. We both continued to stand near our exit, frozen in shock. Who could it be? Why would anybody need help in this place? We explored this cabin and we know the area. You could hardly get hurt around here. I got rid of my shock and slowly I went near the shouts. My friend, upon realizing that I was making my way towards the shouts, pulled me back. She told me that it might be a trap and that I should not go any nearer to the person. She also said that the voice seems off. She does not understand why, but she knows that there is something off about the screams. No later when she said that, we heard some other people shout if the mysterious screaming person was okay. Quick movements were heard somewhere in the cabin. Fear struck us both, and we slowly walked backwards to the door. The movements that we heard seemed inhuman. The sound we heard is like the sound of the wind of a jump rope makes when going really fast. Not only that, but after the event, when my friend got the courage to speak about this event, she said that she saw a blur move across the room near where, maybe, the other people were at. By the time we were at the door, the other people came. They were 2 unfortunate men. They both looked around before seeing us. "Are you two okay?" one of them asked. We gave no response. We were still afraid what was in the house. One step forward towards us was enough. "Are you Dash?" He got cut off. The thing that was lurking in the shadows came out. It attacked the man. The thing was bony and the skin was pale and rotten. It looked human, but it clearly wasn't. The thing ripped the head of the poor man. We did not see the rest of it, for we booked out of the cabin and ran as fast as we could. All we heard is scream, but as soon as we heard it, it was cut off. Then there was another one, but this one was inhuman. We both did not stop until we reached the town. We never spoke to this event to anybody, not even when people have asked us if we were okay, since we both looked pale and out of breath. Be careful out there in the woods. You never know what might happen. May the Lord save you if you come across one of them. 10th story. This story was shared by you/Lilith Maynard. Ever heard of a skinwalker? I've avoided telling this story before because I want to believe that it wasn't real, that it was just a dream. But I've read so many similar encounters that I feel like maybe I should tell someone. Maybe it was real and something like this really lives out there. I wish I'd known it was possible back then. The story starts at my aunt's house. At the time, my mother and father were going through a divorce. I was about 11 and my younger sister was only 6. The details of the divorce don't really matter, but we were staying at my aunt's house with my mom until she could find a place she could afford on her own. My sister and I were too young to fully understand, so it was almost like a vacation. It helped that my aunt had a really cool house. It was a big and seemed even bigger to a couple of kids. I don't really know house lingo, but it was very modern, with 2 long main wings. One side housed the bedrooms and a small library. The other had the kitchen. The kitchen had these huge windows, the kind lots of more modern-styled houses have where they take up the whole wall. Nestled in this wall of windows was a sliding glass door, but my sister and I rarely used it because it was large and heavy and hard for us to open. Another thing about these windows, though, was that they faced the woods. My aunt's house was surrounded right on the edge of a large wooded area. The trees ended only a couple feet away from where the sliding glass door was. Of course, this was one of the benefits of her house. Living near the woods was peaceful, or at least that's what my aunt always said. My aunt had a small sitting area by the windows where she could watch nature. She told us that oftentimes she'd had little herds of deer walk through, and that she'd even seen a mountain lion once. Anyway, you get the idea. It was a big house with big windows, and it sat close to the woods. For the majority of the time that we lived there, we had no issue. My sister and I would even go play in the woods, always staying inside of the house. My mother would often sit in the sitting area by the windows and keep an eye on us. We'd play hide and seek, or tag, or see if we could climb the trees. Things changed at night, though. I hated those windows at night. When I'd walk down the long hallway to the south wing of the house to get a glass of water from the kitchen or something, I'd always see the trees moving, swaying unnaturally. Not like from wind, where it started from the top and worked its way down, but like something was pushing against them from below, and the tree shook from that. It freaked me out, but I was 11, so it wasn't that hard. I'd usually just hurry up and get my water and run back to my room. I hated it so much that I rarely forgot to get water before bed after the first couple's times. Wasn't risking that creepy shit again. Later on, I wasn't given a choice, though. One night I had a dream that my mother was calling me. Her voice was coming from the kitchen, asking for my help with something. I stood up from bed and made my way towards where she called, my brain fuzzy from sleep. Her voice was soft, but it carried to me as I walked, warm and familiar. The closer I got, though, the weirder it sounded, becoming slightly distorted and deeper. It was like a mix of my mother's voice with some animalistic cries that just got louder until I was shocked awake, just before I stepped through the doorway into the kitchen. I quickly looked around, confused. My mom wasn't there, and the whole house was dark except for the moonlight that illuminated just enough of the room for me to know it was empty. I shrugged it off as a sleepwalking dream, though I'd never had one before, so I turned around and walked back to my room. A few nights passed before it happened again. This time, it was my father who called me. "Please," he called, "I need to talk to you. Come here." Just like last time, I stood up from my bed like in a trance, aware and unaware of what I was doing. Each step brought me closer to the kitchen where I could hear my father, his voice becoming more gravelly and broken as I walked. I stepped into the kitchen and thought I saw him there, standing by the kitchen island, illuminated in the moonlight. He turned and looked at me, and I woke up, realizing there was nothing there after all. It took a few days again, but on the third night I heard my little sister. She was crying for me, telling me she hurt herself and she needed my help. I stood up and started hurrying to the kitchen, ever the big sister. This time I barely noticed when her voice started changing, becoming a distorted gasp as I drew closer. I stepped into the kitchen and saw her. She was knelt crying on the ground near the windows. I started to walk over to her but stopped when I realized something. She was kneeling behind the glass. She was outside. Her cries became a laugh, and I startled awake, but I still saw a shape kneel just outside the window. Only it was bigger and dark and misshaped. I screamed in terror and it moved, faster than anything I'd seen before, disappearing into the woods. My mother came running from her room, turning on the lights and comforting me. I'd told her about the sleepwalking and passing, so she chalked it up to me still having been asleep when I told her about the monster. She walked me back to my room and had me take some sleeping medicine to help me get back to sleep. After that, everything seemed like it might be okay. A week passed, and then two. My mom found a nice apartment that she planned to move us into. My sister and I were sad to leave, but I was secretly relieved. I'd been on edge every night since it happened, wondering if it would call to me again. But everything was silent until the night before we were meant to leave. I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard shuffling outside my door. I froze, certain that the monster had returned for me, that it had somehow gotten in the house and was about to open my door, but the sound simply moved past me and down the hallway toward the kitchen. I stayed where I was, waiting to make sure it wasn't a trick, then got up as quietly as I could and crept over to the door. I hovered, unsure if I should open it. After a few seconds, I made up my mind to run to my mom's room and wake her up. I slowly cracked open the door and peeked into the hallway towards where the sounds were coming from. There, at the end of the hallway and shuffling into the kitchen, was the form of my little sister. I blinked and then squeezed my eyes shut and opened them again, making sure I wasn't asleep. But no, she was real, and she was disappearing into the kitchen right before my eyes. As I realized this, I realized I could hear something, a kind of faraway moaning whine coming from the direction she was going. Dread ran up my body, and I looked down the hallway at my mom's door, the opposite direction that my sister was walking. Fear told me to run and get her first, but instinct moved my feet towards the kitchen where my sister had gone out of my sight. I ran as silently as I could down the hall and peered around the doorway to look for her. There she was. She was standing right in front of the windows, her eyes open but glazed. As I watched, I realized the trees were swaying the same way they used to, but much faster now, and the swaying seemed to be getting closer, moving towards us at an alarming speed. I could hear branches breaking and the trees creak in protest as something hit them, and the moaning whine I had heard from far away was getting louder, sounding like a dying animal. One tree was rocked so violently a flock of birds flew screaming out of it into the night air. As this was happening, my sister was reaching for something, the lock on the sliding door. Even at 11, I knew something was coming through the woods towards us, and it was running, sprinting, right at my sister. I ignored my brain screaming at me to run the other way and raced towards my sister. The noise was all-encompassing now. It had become a screeching so loud it sounded like it was all around me. I grabbed my sister around the waist, pulling her back just before her fingers touched the lock, and I pulled both of us behind the wall beside the windows, just out of sight. The sound stopped, the trees no longer swayed, and the screeching had fallen silent. I could hear my sister breathing frantically, but I held her mouth closed, willing her not to cry. My own breathing was shallow and fast, but as I tried to quiet it, I realized there was another sound. My sister's breathing, my breathing, and the even breathing of something else, standing just outside the window next to us. A too large humanoid shadow blocked the moonlight that usually fell into the kitchen, and I watched the figure reach out its unnaturally long arm. I held my breath as I heard a scratch against the sliding door and saw the shadow of the creature's arm touch where the handle of the door was. After a second, the creature withdrew its arm and let it fall to its side. Then it stood there, still for what felt like hours. Finally, the shadow shrunk, and I could hear whatever it was leave. The underbrush rustled and the trees swayed, but the sound moved away this time instead of towards us. Still, I didn't move. I waited until all traces of its presence was gone before I slowly pulled my sister away toward the hall, keeping out of sight of the windows as much as I could. My sister was crying as I led her down the hall, and I think I was squeezing her hand too tight. But I felt overwhelming relief as I opened the door to my mother's room and crawled into her bed. My mother never believed us, of course, and we moved away the next day. I refused to return to my aunt's house ever since, and she eventually moved away. I've never had an encounter like that again, but that might be because I stay away from the woods like a plague now. If you're a fan of hiking or camping or living near nature, all I can say to you is good luck. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.